Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have Alex Gunz, Fund Manager at Heptagon Capital, to discuss what's attractive about wind as an alternative power source. Alex, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Thanks so much, Jill. Always a pleasure to be here.
You got it. Tell us about offshore wind turbines. How much power do they have the capability to produce, and how exactly do they work?
Offshore wind turbines are absolutely massive, Jill, and they are such an impressive sight to see. If you take an offshore wind turbine, the actual blades, they are longer than Big Ben in London is tall, and the gearbox where they're housed is like the size of a typical house. So they're absolutely massive, and a typical offshore wind turbine can probably power one household for about 2 days. So when you accumulate them all together, you're talking about absolutely massive power that they're capable of generating.
Renewable energy has very low marginal costs and is virtually unlimited by physical constraints. Why is wind particularly an attractive power source?
Well, I think you've partly highlighted it yourself, Jill, that there are those low marginal costs and no physical constraints. But think about it like this. It's obviously free, it's abundant. There are no carbon emissions at all. You're not using any water, which is something you'd say be using with coal or with nuclear. There are no hazardous emissions, and that's what makes it really attractive. And then when you think about this huge trend that's going on at the moment, all about geopolitics, if it's a solution that can offer you energy independence, then it's likely to be very attractive.
How do you see offshore growing relative to the rate of onshore?
We're incredibly bullish about the scope for offshore wind growth, and certainly everything we've read would suggest that the offshore industry should grow at about 4 times the rate of the onshore industry. And I guess the easiest way to explain or to think about this is really as following. The offshore is number 1, more scalable, number 2, more efficient, and number 3, more environmentally friendly. So you're effectively getting more bang for your buck with offshore, and with government support, this is really helping to drive it.
Is offshore wind just a European phenomenon?
Offshore wind is certainly most developed in Europe, and I think actually the UK is probably the market globally where you've got most offshore wind deployment. But I think when we look around the world, we see really good evidence of trends elsewhere. Clearly in the US, you've had the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's been very, very helpful to drive offshore wind demand. And then when we look elsewhere, there are countries as far afield as, say, Brazil, India, Japan, South Korea, all of them are pushing on the offshore route as well.
Well, Alex, this almost sounds too good to be true. What should the audience and investors be aware of for building and maintaining offshore wind projects?
I think that's a really fair dynamic, Jill, in the sense that it sounds absolutely lovely in theory, but there are quite a lot of challenges involved. The typical time horizon it takes to get an offshore wind turbine actually operational, from the moment of you signing that contract to the blades turning, that can take 5 to 7 years. So there are a lot of hurdles to go through. The permitting process in particular, certainly in Europe, is very complicated. We hear there are about 2,000 projects probably in backlog waiting for permitting at the moment. And then one final consideration, having offshore wind turbines is great, but I'd say it's only really necessary rather than sufficient. What you really need is actually the robust infrastructure, the grid connectors, and the other parts as well to make everything fit together.
And finally, which companies have exposure to offshore wind?
Well, when we look at the offshore wind market, and certainly strip out China for one moment, because that's a totally separate market, there are really only 3 players that dominate the manufacture of turbines ex-China. You've got a subsidiary of GE, you've got a subsidiary of Siemens, and then the only pure play business based in Denmark called Vestas. One final comment I'd make, Jill, is just to come back to this point about turbines being necessary but not sufficient. It could also be really interesting for people, for investors, potentially to look at other players that operate within the value chain. So those companies that are providing that vital infrastructure, those interconnection links.
All right, Alex, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.